The real problem with fancy algs. Let's get this out of the frame. The real problem with fancy algs. So I'm going to make this a 3-part series, I think, because there are 3 fairly unique but related topics that I do want to talk about. I'm not going to be doing an alg and then popping the cube. I actually want to talk about some actual problems I have with fancy alg in the context of CFOP. Some of these will be applicable to other methods, but as always, I do all of my stuff cubing-wise through a CFOP lens. So yeah, you already know. So part 1, problem with fancy algs. So the first 2 videos I think I'm going to focus mostly on F2L, and I'm going to be talking about the problem with doing fancy algs early on into your solve. And when I say fancy, I'm going to be mostly talking about algs that avoid doing a rotation, and on paper they, the speed that it takes compared to doing it the normal way may even be better, or it's comparable to doing a rotation or something like that. I'm also making the assumption that you are not literally T-Moan and can plan 3 pairs in inspection like 1 every 5 solves. I'm assuming you're reasonable, you've gotten pretty good, and you can do cross plus 1 fairly competently. So, with that in mind, let's talk about look ahead and being able to see sides of the cube. So what I have right here is I have this F12 pair. Normally you would either do something like this and insert it as your first pair, or you might rotate the other way and do it this way with slightly more annoying finger tricks, but at least you fill up a back slot. Or you could do it the fancy way and do that. And I guess I could show that alg if I really wanted to. I will, I'll be nice. It's like this, da-dam, ba-bam, alakazam, whatever. That can be cool in some contexts. You do need this slot to be empty for it to work. But that's not important. What's important is that after you do this fancy schmancy alg as your first pair, let's see how good your look ahead becomes. It's not really that great. You can kind of see that this is a pair if you've got enough experience. But other than that, you don't really see what's going on with the F2L. Whereas if you start the solve here, you see this, you don't really see much else, you rotate. Now you see these edges here, and then you see this corner pop up. Now you actually see your second pair. And we could actually take this to its logical conclusion. There is a fancy trick for this pair to save a rotation that looks like this, but now our front slots are filled and we don't see anything. Whereas if we dumb it down a little bit and get objectively not optimal, we rotate this way, ooh, we actually see something. We see a corner here. And we can do this, or we could even be fancy and do a sledge knowing that we can set this up. Again, that's not as important. Point being, fancy F12 tricks are good and they are worth learning, but they are also very contextual. And if you are not literally T-Moan and can plan 2 pairs every time and a 3rd pair on top, like 1 in 5 solves or whatever, look ahead is a thing that you need to be good at. And it is something you cannot ignore. And the easiest way to give yourself look ahead is just to do quick rotations between pairs. And then with those rotations, you have a very good chance to be able to find information for your next pair. This is especially true if you are trying to speed optimize your F2L solutions and do them from angles where it's quick to execute them from to an extent. Not to the ridiculous fancy extent, but to the extent where you're prioritizing maybe solving front slots over back slots just so you avoid like this finger trick. But again, that's not super important once you learn how to do these from home grip. In the right context, that is. Point being, if you misuse fancy F2L tricks and you are not a god at inspection, you are going to give yourself look ahead issues. So that is pretty much all I wanted to cover in part 1 of the real problem with fancy algs, I guess in this case fancy F2L algs. Again, the tricks are worth learning, however you do have to contextualize them and do them in the right scenarios. So going back to that very first trick, so this one where you have like this slot unsolved, if you've already solved 2 pairs in the back, then doing this trick that I showed from earlier actually becomes quite nice because your look ahead is not going to suffer and you will be able to transition into the next steps very nicely. So yeah, that is part 1. Stay tuned for part 2, which will come out at some point in the near future.